Not yet.
Okay, that's Hello, I'm Joshua Goodman, a Miami-based reporter for the Associated Press, and we've assembled today an amazing panel of military strategists, policymakers, and practitioners to talk about the national security implications surrounding illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. I wanted to start with two brief plugs. The first, the excellent report by the American Security Project titled Bad Catch, which goes into many of the same topics that we'll be discussing today. And secondly, a story published by the AP on Friday based on an 18-day voyage that I took this summer with the Sea Shepherd to see up close the Chinese distant water fishing fleet on the high seas near the Galapagos Islands, something very pertinent to our discussion today. We're going to begin with a 2 to 5 minute introduction of each of the panelists to give their unique perspective on this issue, and then hopefully we'll go into a discussion and take some questions from those of you watching us virtually. We're going to begin with Liberia's National Defense Minister, Daniel Ziankon. He's the 36th Minister of Defense of Liberia, and he's one of the country's most senior military leaders, bringing both theoretical and practical knowledge to the table in the managing of the defense sector of Liberia. Minister Ziankon, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning to my fellow panelists and to our audience in Zoom line. I think my name have already been said by Major General Daniel Ziankon, retired, the Minister of National Defense of the Republic of Liberia. I'm glad to be invited on this panel and to discuss the challenges associated with IUU, fishing, and the observation from the field. Prior to the coming of Sea Shepherd Operation Solar Stella, we have been having some issues along our coastline. So, because we have been having a very, very bad civil war for about 2 decades. So that era was like an ungoverned era. So when Sea Shepherd came, we extended an invitation to them in 2017, and they came. We started to partner. But I think what really struck me to have extended this invitation to them mainly it was because how this nest into our national security. And so when they came, we started to patrol, and actually they brought in the ships and the resources, that is the fuel and the operating crew. And so we provided the Coast Guard personnel for us to patrol with them. We started to carry out some arrests. As we speak, we have arrested about 15 ships, and so we have transitioned from that to the deterrence phase. For the past 1 or 2 years, we have not really had any issues along our borders. So I think this partnership, I look up to that. The government of Liberia is very pleased from the president to everybody in the security sector for us to continue this. Thank you.
Okay. Admiral Fallon needs no introduction. He is retired from the U.S. Navy after a distinguished 40-year military and strategic leadership career. He's led U.S. and allied forces in 8 separate commands and played a leadership role in military and diplomatic matters at the highest levels of the U.S. government. As head of U.S. Central Command, Admiral Fallon directed all U.S. military operations in the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Horn of Africa, focusing on combat efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. He also led, particularly relevant to our discussion today, he led the Pacific Command for 2 years, directing political military activities in the Asia-Pacific region. Admiral Fallon, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you because I think the topic today is very important, and it's important for everyone in this world. So the seas occupy 3/4 of the surface of our globe, our home. The seas contain an incredible amount of sea life, and much of this is a key component of the sustainment of people around the world. And so the the increasing trend towards unregulated and illegal activities on the seas regarding the sustenance that lives in it is of great importance. And I think I commend, first of all, the ASP for doing this, and for each of the panelists for contributing. So as Josh indicated, I spent a lot of time in the Navy, and during that time, I got a chance to visit all the oceans of the world, pretty much throughout the globe. And what I saw was some things that are pretty tragic. The quality of life in the sea is declining due to a number of factors, pollution, and the particular topic this morning, the unregulated and illegal catch that's being hauled from the seas. So why is this important to national security? To me, it's primarily important because there are so many people in this world that depend on, for their livelihood and for their existence, on the fish and other creatures that are in the sea. And in many of these places, the folks who are most dependent on these creatures from the sea do not have the resources that we see deployed now that are vacuuming up vast quantities of fish and other wildlife from the oceans. They're dependent on sustenance fishing for their livelihood. And the challenge is that much of this UII fishing is taking place in and around countries that have little to no ability to prevent it. And in some cases, they're being bribed, and corruption is becoming endemic. So at the bottom line, you have people who do not have sophisticated methods. They depend on age-old ways to harvest things from the sea. And those creatures are disappearing. And so they're being denied their basic ability to exist. Another major factor is that the corruption that comes with the folks that perpetrate this activity, either illegal criminal gangs or in some cases state supported and state supplied and state endorsed actors. The corruption that ensues from this leads to less good governance. It leads to more corruption within the states, and it's a downward spiral that we see being repeated in many places around the world. So all of this leads to insecurity. So at the top, I think the food insecurity challenge, the fact that a lot of the sustenance is being taken out of the seas and denying people their basic existence. And the second is that this governance, corruption, lack of governance spreading around the world is undermining the ability of countries to take care of their people. And it also undercuts a lot of other activities. So when you get places that are poorly governed or unregulated, the bad actors of the world tend to flock to these places, and we have a continuing spiral of insecurity. And so it's a major concern. The biggest challenge I see is the seas are so vast. They cover this incredible large portion of the globe, and there just are not enough folks out there that are actually trying to keep things in balance to try and regulate it. There are many areas that are very distant from coastlines where the bad actors basically can operate unseen. And that's where Sea Shepherd and its crew have come in, because they've helped to put a spotlight on some of these activities, and in some cases to actually help to arrest this problem. So I'd like to end it there. Thanks very much. It's really a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you very much, Admiral. Our next panelist, Rear Admiral Scott Clendenin, serves as the U.S. Coast Guard Assistant Commandant for Response Policy. He's responsible for the U.S. Coast Guard policy in 7 operational mission areas, including emergency management, disaster response, defense operations, law enforcement, search and rescue, maritime security, counterterrorism, and marine environmental response.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to ASP. This is just a phenomenal, distinguished panel. And it's a real privilege to be a part of this. And we relish these moments to interact with everyone on this important topic, because this is very much a team sport. I think the two panelists before me set the cause for action here very well. At the heart of it, as the United States, we are the largest single market for fish products, and we are the third largest wild seafood producer. So we bear responsibility as we think about this particular issue, but every nation does. This is no one nation can fix this. And every nation bears the responsibility to team together on this, to regulate their distant water fishing fleets and ensure that their actions of their fishing fleets are consistent with rules-based behavior in the international arena. So why is this a major mission for the Coast Guard? And that's in part because the Commandant told me it is. But he attended the International Sea Power Symposium hosted by the Chief of Naval Operations years ago when he was Land Area Commander. And he was used to navies and fellow services around the world approaching on maritime issues such as search and rescue, counter narcotics, piracy, major concerns like that. But he had the realization that what they wanted to talk about was the scourge of IUU fisheries and the impact, the real negative impact that has on the maritime security and maritime environment, as the Admiral laid out very well there. So he charged us with coming up with a plan ahead, and so I just hold it up. We do have what we call our strategic outlook for IUU, and we also have an implementation plan, and that's all been within the last year. The Admiral, we told the Admiral it would take about a year, and he said, "How about 3 months?" And we made that deadline, and we did that in many parts through collaboration with interagency and international partners, with NGOs, and a lot of conversations. And so this in our minds is not just a Coast Guard strategy, but it's how we partner to really bring about change. And I just real quickly just talk about the lines of effort. So one is to promote intelligence-driven operations. And that's not always just a seizure of a vessel. Sometimes it's easier for our foreign partners to conduct the seizure. Sometimes it's better just to document the behavior of the fishing vessel and handle it through international forums. So the end game, as we call it, may be different in this particular mission set. Intelligence is not just U.S. intelligence, but it's a collaborative, technology-driven information sharing, not just with foreign governments and interagency partners, but it's very important too with NGOs and private organizations that often know more about what is happening in any particular region. And so in that way, it's somewhat unique here in that we are trying to drive an entire network and sharing of information worldwide. Our line of effort two is to counter the predatory and irresponsible state behavior. And we see the diplomatic tools, the RFMOs, really bringing some sort of teeth, some sort of deterrence through those organizations so that we can have people, again, join all other nations in good rules-based behavior at sea and encourage governance around the world in our ocean, in our sea space. And the last issue is to expand those multilateral fisheries enforcement cooperation. RFMOs often allow us to board and ensure that nations are monitoring their own fishing vessels, but we need more. And we should be able to go on board and do an inspection of those vessels, full inspection. And we would encourage the RFMOs to allow at-sea inspection as a condition of entry, as a part of their organization, so that we can all collaboratively board the foreign fishing vessels in any particular region together with other nations to ensure compliance and rules-based behavior. So I'll stop there and really, again, appreciate the invitation for you.
Thank you, Rear Admiral. Our final panelist joining us virtually from Amsterdam is Captain Alex Cornelsen. He's the CEO for Sea Shepherd Global, an organization dedicated to protecting marine wildlife and ending habitat destruction in the world's oceans. He first joined the organization in 2002, steadily gathering extensive experience and leadership skills, and he's participated in more than 25 Sea Shepherd campaigns and has played a crucial role in protecting marine wildlife globally. Captain, please.
Thanks so much, Josh. Let me just start by saying this is, in my 20 years, this is the first time I'm actually on a panel with a minister and two admirals. So this is definitely a first. Very honored to be part of this panel. Very privileged to be able to speak at this event. Sea Shepherd is an organization that was founded in 1977. So we've been around quite a while. But in recent years, we've been focusing more and more on cooperation with governments. And of course, one of our longest standing partnerships is with the government of Liberia, which we are particularly proud of. That's a campaign where we've been able to address the issue of illegal fishing inside the EEZ of Liberia. And together with our government partners, we've been able to assist them in the arrest of multiple fishing vessels. Now, these campaigns make a huge impact on illegal fishing. Illegal fishing is a global problem, and more countries, luckily, are discovering that. More and more people are looking at the issue and seeing the threat to national security. So I think it's really important that we all join forces and work on the issue of IUU fishing, of illegal fishing. In our time with Sea Shepherd, we have seen crossing the Pacific Ocean or in any of the other missions that I've been part of, that the diminishment of species in the ocean is becoming more and more clear. The amount of seabirds is diminishing, the amount of turtles are disappearing, there's less and less dolphins, there are less and less whales. I remember my first crossing on Sea Shepherd vessel in 2002. We crossed from the Galapagos Islands to New Zealand, and I heard the stories about whales crossing the bow of the ship, about pods of dolphin in the ocean. And in that trip, we saw not a single whale, not one. And that was a trip of 3 weeks, 3.5 weeks, going from Galapagos Islands for the stop in Tahiti and on to New Zealand. And we didn't encounter any whales. So I was wondering, did we take the wrong route or what's happening? And it just turns out that there is far less whales than, and of course, because of commercial whaling, the whales have all but disappeared and they're slowly recovering. But we're seeing the same happen to other species, to, as I said, seabirds and turtles and sharks. And it's largely caused by illegal fishing. Now, illegal fishing, of course, is, if you look at the fish populations around the world, it is a very growing problem. When the resources are disappearing and far less fish are available, and then you also have a growing number of operators that are going in and fishing illegally, it puts further strain on the already limited amount of species out there. And that's why we really need to target this. And that's something that Sea Shepherd acknowledges and that our government partners also acknowledge, that we can actually stop IUU fishing in a large part of the ocean. And that is through cooperation with governments, that is through cooperation with other NGOs, by forming partnerships, and to really look at this issue and really addressing it, to get digital information, satellite information, all the amount of information that we can get to actually target this problem. But we still need enforcement. We still need vessels out on the ocean to physically inspect fishing vessels. And that's why it's so important that not only our government partners, but that every country around the world recognizes this problem and really addresses it, because we are losing time and we are losing the species in the ocean. I refuse to call it resources, but some people call it resources. Some people look at it as resources, but yeah, they're species, they're ecosystems, and these ecosystems are under severe threat by illegal fishing. So it's a serious problem, and I'm very happy that we have this panel discussion and this event to really look at this issue.
Thank you, Captain. Let's begin our discussion. I'm going to give our honored visitor, General Ziankon, the first question. It's, your government's been battling illegal poachers on your coast for years, but Liberia has very few naval resources to battle the problem, and it's not a country that's a global sea power in the way that the United States is. So how does illegal fishing fit into the national security context of Liberia? And what lessons, if there are any, that you think other countries, especially in the developing world, can learn from what Liberia has done to tackle this problem?
Thank you, Josh. I think your question is very, very important. If we look at the instrument of national power, I think the military folks here would know that we talk about democracy, talk about information, talk about the military, and we talk about the economy. So I think looking at the two last part of that, trying to regulate IUU in my era, that's just one of my portfolio, but I'm concerned about food security, because we have the 6 nautical inshore, the 6 nautical mile inshore for our artisanal fishermen, and I think I'm touch on that. So if we have all of those, your trawlers, those Chinese, your trawlers that would just come and scoop out all of those fries, I mean, that would bring in food insecurity, and that would nest into my own broader national security threats. So, and we are just looking at the IUU about the same way that people get on the sea and they go to work, they carry out human trafficking and drugs trafficking. So I look at it, I'm not the minister that is the minister of fishery, but I think I have to look at that. And so with the coming in of Sea Shepherd, I think we have been doing pretty much great work with the rest of over 15-year vessels. I think we have deterred, and so that is a very great thing. If you, and then I think your second question has to do with what lessons can other countries learn? I think I've started to talk with some of my colleagues, and I think they have seen the reason that the public-private partnership is something that is worth venturing into. And to give an example, just about 2 months ago, it was through the Sea Shepherd, along with the Liberian Coast Guard, that were able to save about 12 lives from a sunken vessel. We were on an operation along the Liberian-Sierra Leone border, but when the distress call came, and that has to do with, because you can have all of the intelligence that the Admiral talked about, but you have to have boots on the ground. And so with some of those developing nations that don't have the resources, I think it would be more than great for them to partner with organizations like Sea Shepherd. So I think that's a great thing.
Great, great. I want to bring our 2 American panelists into the conversation, Admiral Fallon and Rear Admiral Clendenin. On any given day, the U.S. is buffeted by an enormous number of international threats, from cyber attacks by hostile governments to the threat of international terrorism. And my sense is if consumers think of fish at all, it's usually from a health or an environmental perspective, not a national security perspective. So my question basically is, how do you get Americans to care about this issue from the national security perspective? Admiral Fallon, why don't we begin with you? Oh, we can't hear you. 1 second. And, muted.
Sorry, tried to help us out here and stumbled anyway. It's you've highlighted a real problem. I think for most folks, it's out of sight, out of mind. It's a big ocean. Who knows? Just no interest whatsoever. But as I tried to illustrate in my introductory comment, this all contributes to insecurity. And it starts pretty far down the population food chain, if you would, in smaller countries, distant parts of the world, countries that have limited resources to both take care of themselves and police the bad actions of others. And so I think our folks just don't get it. They don't really think about it. So how to put a little light on this? Unfortunately, the Navy doesn't do too much in this day to day in the business of the fishing. Law enforcement, we rely on the Coast Guard to do it. I can tell you that when I was in the Pacific with a vast ocean area of responsibility, I was very, very dependent on our Coast Guard to do day-to-day things. And frankly, they led the initiatives with other countries, which I think is critical. As someone already mentioned, this isn't going to get cleaned up with any one country doing whatever it can do. It's going to require folks all around the world to cooperate. But this gives us an opportunity, I think, for navies. The Admiral mentioned the International Sea Power Symposium and the emphasis of discussion there. I think that's a great venue to basically spread the word about cooperation. But then that's primarily external. To get it back to your question, I think just highlighting the fact that this increase in consumption of fish, and recognize here that we're in a bit of a dilemma. So we have a lot of people in the health affairs realm that are telling us, look, you got to stop eating all this, the flesh of the land animals, and the fish are much better for you. Okay, great, I'll take that one. But on the other hand, we have to be responsible. And I think the actions of individual consumers, people need to think about it. And one of the ways that we might be able to do this is by highlighting activities such as this panel, the efforts of Captain Corneliusen and his organization that are out there trying to actually do something about it. So there's no magic here. I think it's going to take increased publicity. It's going to take attention to the problem, and as Sea Shepherd has done, to illustrate some of the really bad behaviors out there, which I think strike most people as pretty repugnant. And the more that we can illuminate these, I think the better chance we have of getting the attention and then the resources to help combat this problem.
Yeah, it was heartened to hear from Captain Cornelsen that this is the first time he's had a panel with a minister, and probably with, I'm guessing, a top U.S. military official as well. So, Rear Admiral, do you want to take a stab at this too? How do we get Americans to care about this?
Yes, so I take all the Admiral's points and certainly agree with that. We are the largest consumer of seafood. And so with that comes responsibility on where are we purchasing the seafood from. I think most Americans would agree that we have to have sustainable seafood, and we have to listen to our partners that are very concerned about this. So this does become certainly a security issue for the reasons that the minister certainly pointed out. One of the tools to encourage companies is to really look at how they're sourcing their seafood and look at the companies that they deal with that deal with IUU, or there's other ills associated with this, this illicit industry, to include forced labor and other things. So if we can have more poor state controls and some industry regulation to make sure that we know how our seafood's sourced, I think that will certainly bring awareness on this situation. And to the Admiral's point, all DOD has become very involved with this. There's been a lot of partnership. We do have naval ships and naval aircraft that participated in our activities with this, but not just the U.S. Navy, but countries like Portugal and Brazil have asked that we do shared patrols where we embark members on their ships as well. So it's really building the international call for action here.
Rear Admiral, I want to stay with you because you mentioned it, but I just want to emphasize it. This report that he mentioned, it's a year-old report. It's the strategic outlook by the Coast Guard. And I think what people don't realize, I certainly didn't realize before I got interested in this topic, is that now the U.S.'s #1 maritime security threat is IUU fishing. It's overtaken piracy. And I just wanted to know, in the year that this report made that declaration, what sort of concrete actions or steps have we seen as a result of that designation from the Coast Guard?
Yes, so we've been having robust conversation and engagement with partners. We have increased patrols. we used to sail by distant water fishing fleets because we were focused on other missions. We didn't necessarily pay all the attention that was due to the challenge of seeing a distant water fishing fleet, perhaps where it could be troublesome for one of our partner nations. So we've increased emphasis on IUU in all our patrols. We've partnered with the Navy, for example, with the government of Ecuador around Galapagos for operations. We've worked with the nations of Africa with focused patrols on IUU and helping with them with awareness and helping us learn about that region as well. And we also have sent ships, for example, down to the South Atlantic, the Stone on her maiden voyage, one of our newest ships, really to focus on IUU in that region. So we are matching our actions, but there's a lot more to do, as I mentioned. There has to be an entire international coalition and information sharing network that has to be built, and that will take time.
Captain Cornelsen, you have the Rear Admiral's attention, and you're on the waters every day, and Sea Shepherd's on the water every day, documenting abuses and assisting authorities in countries in Africa and elsewhere. Based on what you're seeing, what does deterrence look like? If you could tell the Rear Admiral 2 or 3 things that he and other governments need to be doing on this issue to dissuade these bad actors, what would they be?
Well, first of all, enforcement, to actually have the vessels inspect these illegal parties, to actually board them and inspect it, see if they're actually complying with regulations. And of course, penalties. That's obviously inside the national waters of a country, but a country can certainly put a huge fine on a fishing vessel, even confiscation of vessel, depending on the vessel. And those fines can then benefit the revenue of the country. So it's a really good model. You stop illegal fishing, at the same time you make the infractors pay for their crimes and use that money to boost in your own enforcement department. So I think that's a great model. I heard that we talked about Galapagos several times. I used to be the director of Galapagos for about 6 years for Sea Shepherd. It's my second home. I care deeply for the islands. But I also know that there's still a lot of illegal fishing happening in the Galapagos waters. I spoke to a local fisherman once. They go out, just like in Liberia, they go out in a small boat, they catch a few fish, and it's just to feed their family. And they're telling me the story that on one night, a purse seiner, a tuna boat, would come in, put out their nets inside the Galapagos Marine Reserve, which is illegal. And they would fish out pretty much in one night what the entire community of Galapagos fishermen would fish out in a year. So the impact of one vessel is tremendous. And if that continues, then you can wipe out entire schools, entire populations in a certain area. And that's why it's so important that, that we really work together. Install devices like AIS. We build an AIS network in the Galapagos Island that is now mandatory for each vessel going to the Galapagos. Now, those are tools that we can use to combat illegal fishing.
The issue of enforcement and penalties is key. I was surprised to learn that there are major fishing vessels that are caught red-handed illegally fishing, and they pay the equivalent of $15,000 and are allowed to leave. I mean, it seems like, as you said, a missed opportunity for governments who need the resources to really jack up the penalties for some of this behavior that everyone agrees is illegal and not ethical. I want to go to the big whale in the room, which might be China. Admiral Fallon, we've seen an expansion of the Chinese distant water fishing fleet taking place at the same time. We've seen China's Navy flex its muscle globally. I just saw there was some naval ships from China in the Bering Strait near Alaska. Can you talk us through what the connection is between the Chinese distant water fishing fleet and the People's Liberation Army Navy? Is this like the 21st century equivalent of like the little ships of Dunkirk during World War II? Explain to us how the two interact, if at all.
Sure. Well, they're very closely related. And in fact, there's a significant amount of interaction between the PLAN, as it's known, the Chinese Navy, and their fishing fleet. So the number of boats and ships alone is difficult to gauge. I've seen numbers from several thousand to upwards of 20,000 vessels of significant size that are engaged in offshore fishing for China. This is basically an auxiliary fleet of the Chinese Navy. These vessels are all equipped with navigation and communications equipment by the state, and they are required to regularly report information, and they basically become an extra set of thousands of extra sets of eyes and ears on the high seas and oceans throughout the world. So this all helps, in my experience, to provide an intelligence picture for China. And but the reality is that this fleet, if you would, is often employed in a method that has contributed to instability. For example, in the South China Sea, the Chinese have taken to using these non-gray hulls, as we call them, not the large warships that we see in China, but they use these fishing vessels as a way to extend their influence and to try to bully their neighbors. So the South China Sea is a complex piece of water. There are many claims and counterclaims, and it's ripe. It's a ripe area for discussion and for communication between countries to try to resolve issues. But the fact of the matter is that the Chinese use the presence and influence of these large numbers of vessels to try to get what they want out of the neighbors. And there were several photographs that ran around the world that showed hundreds of significantly sized Chinese vessels anchored in an area that is claimed by the Philippines, for example, and these are regularly used as a way to project influence and to try to get through coercion what they really want. So it's not just fishing; it's the whole business of influence around the world. And we see again they'll go to distant places. So places that the U.S. doesn't normally patrol, the South Seas, for example, around the Antarctic. These are very, very precious areas of resources, marine life. Not many people go down there. The weather's kind of not too hospitable for a good chunk of the year. But the Chinese are there, and they're using these long line vessels. I'm sure Captain Alex could fill us in on some of the things he's seen.
Sure
But
can.
they basically do what they want down there, and there's not much that the world has done about it yet. So I think we need to recognize what's going on, recognize that this is a very significant extension of the state instruments of China, and we ought to be reacting accordingly.
Okay, I think it's funny, though, that they have constant communication with the Chinese authorities, and yet when we were there seeing the fleet, they were not so communicable, and we actually saw them doing many what looked like maritime violations with AIS systems, tracking systems turned off. It's sort of a contradiction. I also want to pose this sort of question to the minister as well. I'm very curious to know, you've seized several Chinese vessels off the coast of Liberia, and I'm just curious, what does the interaction with the Chinese authorities look like after you've taken a significant action like that? Do they respond respond positively and try to work out a solution? Do they take reprisals? Do they ignore you? I think it would be very interesting for our panel to know what the Chinese do when they've been caught doing, when their vessels have been caught doing something bad.
Thank you, Judge. Over the past years, I think we have arrested few of the ships. And so our own role, the Ministry of Defense, and by extension, the Armed Forces of Liberia, we carry out the arrest, and then we turn over the ship to the Ministry of Justice and the fisheries. And so we will hold on to that ship until they go through all of the funds. So yes, they have reached out to us, but I think they know that we really don't want to compromise because, like I said earlier, if we compromise that, our artisanal, the fishermen will be left with nothing because they just have their 6 nautical mile inshore to fish. So if we allow those big trawlers that are using gill nets and various nets to just come and scoop those fish, I mean, that will bring some level of food insecurity. So when we arrest them, we turn it over to the Ministry of Justice, and then we try to follow through that they pay all of those fines that are levied on them. And so this is why for the past 1 or 2 years, we have not seen anything like that in our waters.
So
I could just add to that, if I can just add to that, that the Chinese government in general is obviously concerned about the safety of their Chinese national civilians on board the fishing vessels, but when it comes to the actual fishing vessels, they most often take the position that these are companies and they're not under control of the Chinese government. So they just take their hands off the issue, really.
Although it's worth pointing out, as I'm sure a lot of our panelists know, most of these companies depend heavily on, first of all, fuel subsidies, construction subsidies for building the ships. The state banks own shares of some of these big companies. I mean, they really would not be there without the government support. We have some questions from the audience. This one is for Alex, Captain. With the increased focus, it's a conservation question, and I think a bit of a dilemma that a lot of people have is, with all the focus on IUU fishing, marine pollution, slave labor on the high seas, the ties to organized crime, is there a greater need now for governments of the world to support financially initiatives with agriculture and aquaponics, the breeding of fish? What do you think of that as a conservationist?
Yeah, I mean, the problem with aquaculture, and just take an example, the salmon farms in Norway, is that you are basically feeding them with wild caught fish. So, and of course, there's the transfer of sea lice and other bacteria onto the wild salmon population, like you've seen in Canada. So the problem does go away. In fact, it adds to the problem by having to feed these farm salmon the wild caught fish that quite often is coming from fish pellets, and those are then sourced in countries like Sierra Leone or anywhere else around the world where there's fish pellet factories that are being shipped to China, and then they sell it to the fish farms around the world.
Another good question here from an elected official from a coastal state in the United States. He's asking, are we, just given all the problems associated with fishing in the wild, are we just not better off and safer with a moratorium against all industrial heavy fishing gear fleets so that we can reduce our chances of collapsing the oceans and that the scarce resources can survive? I guess that's sort of similar to the question I posed to you earlier, Captain Cornelsen, is it time for a drastic step like a moratorium on wild sea fishing in certain more developed countries? What do you think?
Yeah, it's the question if Sea Shepherd is in favor of that. By all means, yes, we are definitely in favor of a moratorium. But we also realize that, that's just not going to happen that quickly because people do have an appetite for fish and the demand is there, but we need to look at the way that the fish is sourced, specifically, the supply chain. Where is that fish coming from? And now it's a lot of the times it's just not clear where the fish is being caught or it's being mixed. The illegal catch is being mixed on board of refrigerated cargo ships on the middle of the ocean and mixed with fish that is caught by record, is mixed with fish that is not caught by record, often illegally. And so what ends up on a dinner plate, it's just not clear where it's coming from. So that's something that we really need to put a spotlight on as an international community.
Josh?
Yeah, go ahead, Admiral.
Yeah, if I could take a shot at that one, maybe play the devil's advocate here. So the questioner, I gather, is a coastal state and he knows something about this business. So my observation is that back where I spend most of my time on a tributary to the Chesapeake Bay, I've lived there for many years. I happen to enjoy recreational fishing. I will fish, and if I'm fortunate enough to catch something, I will try to eat it. And if it's an excess, I'll throw it back. But here's the point. My observation of Chesapeake Bay is a great illustration of the challenges we face. So I've watched, I'll just mention 2 species of fish, the so-called striped bass and the bluefish. They used to be in such great abundance that they tell me colonial days you could basically walk on them trying to cross the water. In many cases, they virtually disappeared today. And the reason is overfishing. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But you talk about regulatory agencies. I've watched the two states, the primary states, Virginia and Maryland, and I'm a resident of one of them. Their fisheries policies are in many cases pretty absurd. They wax and wane from nothing or virtually nothing to kind of overreaction. We've got to stop this now, and we overfishing, so let's do something about it. They place moratoriums, they put all kinds of limitations. And then as soon as the fish, which have an amazing ability to, nature being what it is, to begin to regenerate, the pendulum swings the other way. And the next thing you know, we're now in dire straits again. And it just, it's not a coherent policy. It's heavily influenced by special interest. I'll give you one more example. On the Chesapeake Bay, there's a species of fish called menhaden. And these are not fish that we commonly consume, but they're a key ingredient, as the captain mentioned, from everything from sea pellets to fertilizer. They're small fish. They are vacuumed up by huge factory ships. There aren't that many of them, but enough to do damage. And they've been consistently taking these fish out of the bay, which are a primary resource for the other fish I mentioned. And very few people pay attention to it. And when they do, it's incoherent. And so the U.S., the first question you made, you mentioned, Josh, was how can we get people's attention right here in the U.S.? So I would say that instead of trying to direct their attention to the distant seas around Antarctica, look at our own coastal waters. Look at what we're doing to ourselves, and let's pay attention to it. Let's take action. Let's reduce consumption. That's the number one thing, and take care of things in our own backyard. And then I think it'll be a lot easier to work in other parts of the world. But we need to clean up our own act first and foremost. And we're pretty negligent, in my opinion. Thank you.
And it's fascinating, though, because I grew up certainly at a time where everyone said eating fish is healthy for you. It's like you said at the beginning, the alternative to the land-based protein. This is a great question. It's one from Layla, one of our audience, and it's a question I've been asking myself as I've learned about this issue, is has turning off or tampering with the tracking systems been raised as an issue with larger international bodies? And if so, why has there not been repercussions introduced so that offenders are punished for turning off or altering their transponders in the first place? Just for everyone, in case they're not familiar, these are devices that every big ship in the world is required to carry on board. But as the AP and Sea Shepherd saw in our recent voyage to the South Pacific, it's basically a switch, and a lot of them are turned off, and yet nothing really happens. I don't know if the Rear Admiral, you want to start on that?
Thank you very much. That's something that we are very attentive to. And again, this gets back to collaboration in the IT space. A lot of the feeds that monitor those systems are publicly available. And so we can create a concert of nations that are all studying the same data, and we're looking at creating platforms so they can analyze that information and share that information. We specifically look for behavior of people getting near EEZs to target fisheries and turning off their VMS or AIS. That's a behavior that's an indicator of illicit fishing. In addition, if they are at sea for 3 years, you may be dealing with a forced labor case. So there's ways to monitor this and look for illicit behavior and cooperate and report, not just to ourselves, but to the NGOs and to the nations to share that information. And we have boarded vessels and seen that the VMS and the AIS is turned off. We turn it back, that information, we document it, we send it to the flag state. And this kind of gets back to our discussion of flag state and their responsibility. Those that own the biggest distant water fishing fleets, and we're one of them, but other nations as well, they're responsible to monitor the behavior of their fishing fleet. And we collectively all have to build that pressure by reporting and sharing that information, not only in forums like this, through the press, through diplomatic channels, and through regional fisheries management organizations, and building teeth in their ability to make a difference. So it's all of the above that's going to help really encourage rules-based behavior. That at least, there still will be issues, but if we can get the really rogue behavior of a lot of these IUU fleets, the way we're losing our fish stock right now, we'll be able to curtail that a bit and move towards better control mechanisms and better ways to enforce.
I mean, it would be great to document some of the ways you've informed China, for example, about the violations of the maritime laws.
And we do.
And I mean, I think I get the view that it's basically seen as the equivalent of like jaywalking. I mean, it's not something, I'm talking about the AIS transponder issue specifically. It's not something that is in itself so reprehensible, but what's behind it is perhaps of real concern. I don't know if anyone else wants to weigh on that. We have only a little bit amount of time, but I did want to also, Rear Admiral, ask you one more question about, I'm sure no Coast Guard official would ever say they have enough resources. What would you like to see in terms of additional resources to combat this problem? What do you have right now in terms of assets dedicated to law enforcement actions around the world? And maybe you could talk a little bit about some of those non-seizure tools that that the Coast Guard is using and partnerships, the ship rider programs. How many of those do you have right now? Where are you looking to expand? You mentioned Brazil, which I thought was interesting.
Yes, so we're in the midst of the largest recapitalization of our major fleet in our history. We have our national security cutters, 418-foot ships, and then we also have another like Corvette-size ship. The offshore patrol cutter will be coming online soon, and those ships, in large part, they are being focused on IUU. So we are also looking internally in our own resources to repurpose resources and focus on our ability to project and engage with our foreign partners, with the Navy and others to work in the IUU space. So resource-wise, we are moving to focus on this mission. But there's other partners that are doing really important things. I would point to the Defense Innovation Unit right now has a contest out where they have a reward amount of money, and they've gone to the corporate world and to everybody in IT and asked for them to compete, to build an algorithm, to look for anomalous behavior that will point out and help us target IUU behavior. And the idea is once that algorithm is completed, it will be shared with NGOs and foreign nations to be able to use as kind of an open source ability to collaborate. And there's also many different IT platforms right now. And we always talk about intelligence-driven operations. Again, we're really talking about gathering and building a network of information, not just in the traditional IC with our DoD and IC partners, but really with the entire world, sharing information because everybody has interest, regardless of what country it is. And so I think those efforts are some of the initial steps that we're doing right now.
The open source intelligence, that's an interesting area. Definitely would bring attention to this issue for sure. I have another audience question, just a basic one, but I think it's worth us answering. Is illegal fishing by China intended for their domestic market or for export? And how much of that catch makes it to the United States? Does anyone have an answer about this? My understanding is, go ahead.
Share a couple of thoughts on this. First of all, back up a little bit. And so China's got a huge population. And China is, in fact, highly dependent on the resources from the seas to feed their people, and they also have a need to try to get these people employed. So those two factors are motivating the growth of their fishing fleets, and I think in many cases their behaviors. So the answer is twofold. Yes, they feed their own people with the fish, but it's also a substantial cash crop, if you would, And I take Captain Alex's point earlier about how we characterize the bounty of the sea. But the Chinese do both. And it's also pretty instructive to look at their near-shore waters, the South China Sea, East China Sea. They've been pretty well fish clean, and so they're going further abroad. That's one of the motivations for showing up in distant parts of the Pacific and other oceans. They're on the hunt for resources to feed themselves and to put into their economy. So the answer is they do it for both reasons, and their behaviors are, again, easy to point fingers, and I see a lot of things they do that I think are pretty abhorrent, but I also see behaviors in our own country that need to get fixed.
The U.S. is by far probably, well, I don't know, I want to say this, but I know it's more stricter than other countries in protecting our supply chains. And I think the estimates from our own federal government are something like 13% of the fish we consume in the United States do trace back to IUU sources. So even in the U.S., and I'm sure elsewhere in the world, the problem is far worse. Minister, does the fish that the Chinese fish off, or any foreign vessels fish off the coast of Liberia, does any of that get processed? Does that generate any jobs in Liberia? What's the benefit for Liberia from this, if any?
Yeah, no, I think we have some vessels that have been flagged by Liberia. Okay, they bear the flag, okay, the maritime flag, so they pay, they register and pay some taxes, but most of the fish are being exported. It's not for our domestic use.
And they don't even get processed on shore?
No, they don't.
Yeah, well, interesting. A follow-up to the Rear Admiral's previous comments. Will these algorithms that are being developed to pinpoint IUU be shared with the European Union? We have a EU-US working group where we're cooperating well. When may this happen? Is there an estimated release date? So a very targeted question.
I wish I had come with that information. I would be happy to get that information to them on the contest and the completion and the release date. My understanding is it is intended to be shared, so so I can get that information for the participant. So.
Okay. Another question, do you see, maybe this is best taken by you, Alex, since you're on the sea, Captain, do you see climate change impacts exacerbating illegal fishing practices? And I guess what the person means is, I guess the fish are harder to find, so you need to do more, deadlier methods, more sort of high impact methods to actually find the fish. Is that happening?
I'll take the mission you just came back from with Sea Shepherd, just south of the Galapagos with the Chinese squid fleet. I mean, they didn't target squid before. This is something from the last few years because they used to go after other fish. But those fish have all, the finfish have disappeared, so they're moving on to other species. So, of course, that is illegal fishing, but it's also climate change because fish populations are under threat because of illegal fishing, because of plastic pollution, because of global warming, because of all these things, and including climate change. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I mean, just so people know, squid was not something that was very much eaten before, and it has a very short life cycle. It's actually probably doing very, very well, but that's hardly a cause to celebrate. It's because its predators, the sharks and the tuna, have died off or been fished to exhaustion. I kind of want to wrap it up here, and I think we should sort of end on a more hopeful note, hopefully, if we can, and ask everyone to go around and tell me what success looks like in this issue. Is it raising awareness? Are we going to stop the problem? Is that something that's, is it protecting the U.S. supply chains? Kind of for each of you from your own perspective, give me a few minutes on, what success looks like on combating this problem. I'll start with the minister.
Because I think the single most thing that I see is the awareness piece, and trying to have boots on the ground, because you can have all of the intelligence and you can get the data on who's doing what, okay, but you have to have some level of enforcement on the sea.
Rear Admiral, does success look like for you a bunch of new ships that are going to be dedicated to this problem, a huge budget? Tell us specifically the Coast Guard what it measures success by.
We have a lot of resources shifting to this mission. I would agree awareness is one of the first steps. We begin with intelligence, but we have to get to a point where a flag state nation is held responsible for its distant water fishing fleet. And there's a variety of channels for that. We have to have consequence and deterrence. And those penalties could be diplomatic. Those penalties could be not being allowed to visit ports of friendly nations. It could be port state controls and also the prevention of the shipments of seafood that are very clearly linked to IUU fisheries. And it's only in building that network and collaboration with nations that we're going to get after this. And I wouldn't feign to say that we have a full deterrence package in place. Everyone, and this is such a great panel, from a foreign partner to a private organization to DOD and Coast Guard working together. And that's the way this is going to happen.
Admiral Fallon?
So I'm going to take a little optimistic tack here and say that I think awareness is growing in many quarters. Certainly in the U.S., a recognition that we're denuding our sea creatures, and we need to be a lot more attentive to what we're doing. And I think in the policy area, just coming up with coherent policies, domestic policies, such as I highlighted earlier, and in the business of international security, we tend to think navies, big ships, gray hulls, destroyers, aircraft carriers, submarines, but from my experience, a much more important resource is the kind of help that we can provide from the U.S. to other countries, not in these aforementioned big gray hulls, but in the kind of cooperation and assistance that we can engender. For example, to allow the smaller countries to actually get the resources to be able to police their own EEZs, these exclusive economic zones, which for many of them are a stretch out 200 miles. That's a lot of ocean to cover. But by helping them to get the resources, again, not big hulls, but smaller vessels, to get the communication systems that enable them to be able to talk to one another, talk to their neighbors. This is an area that we can really help spread security around the world, and we can also help people to help themselves in this challenge of overfishing.
You get the last word. You depressed us earlier with telling us about how fewer fish you've been seeing the 2 decades with Sea Shepherd. Are you seeing any glimmers of light, though?
Yeah, well, let me then finish on a high note. That is also Liberia. One of the most amazing successes that we booked was the arrest of the Libica 2. It was a Spanish-flagged, Spanish-owned vessel that had a license to fish for tuna. But on board, they had a hidden shark liver oil factory. And upon inspection of the vessel, it turned out that this vessel was killing so many sharks that for the shark liver oil, which generates a tremendous amount of sharks to generate a liter or a ton of shark liver oil. Based on the cash records on board, we discovered that the vessel was killing approximately 500,000 sharks every single year. Now, that vessel was arrested almost 3 years ago and hasn't fished since. So basically, that's 1.5 million sharks saved. Now, that for us is, what we do it for. That is the life saved, the ecosystems protected, and then, and a very negative fishing vessel, a criminal taken out of the commission and no longer able to cause the damages that they were doing before.
Thank you, all of our panelists, for sharing your wealth of knowledge and experience. This was a fascinating discussion. We're going to take a break, and we'll be back at 11:15 for our second panel with Stimson Director Sally Yozel, Sea Shepherd's Peter Hammerstedt, Charles Rego, and ASP American.
All right, good morning. Thank you for joining us. I'm David Haynes. I'm the Senior Fellow for Climate Security here at the American Security Project. Also the co-author of Bad Catch, our recently released white paper on IUU fishing. We're very pleased to start our IUU fishing program here. And we think that starting off with these two panels is a great way to kick off our research on a topic that obviously is of great concern to the American government and people everywhere. I'm joined today by Director of Campaigns for Sea Shepherd, Peter Hammerstedt, Sally Yozel of the Stimson Center, and Charles Rego of U.S. Special Operations Command. As noted in the previous panel, IUU fishing, no matter where it occurs, poses a threat to U.S. national interests by hurting American workers, degrading the marine environment, exacerbating poverty, contributing to global instability, and by facilitating organized criminal activity including money laundering, forced labor, and human trafficking. The sheer size of the oceans make enforcement an exceptionally difficult task, even more so because states have fishing interests far from their shores, often on the high seas. Even a well-resourced country like the United States can benefit from partnerships with private organizations. And I'm pleased to highlight the U.S. Coast Guard's commitment to public-private partnerships in its IUU implementation plan released this July. Less well-resourced states need assistance to patrol their waters, which often comes from non-governmental organizations. We are convening this panel to discuss the advantages of those partnerships and how the U.S. government can utilize them and help partner nations utilize them to combat IUU fishing. Private organizations can assist states by providing access to satellite imagery, coordinating regional partnerships, and even providing assets to states who lack adequate ships to enforce fisheries laws. Our panel features a member of one of those organizations, as well as 2 government experts familiar with enforcement and public-private partnerships. Before I introduce the panelists, I'd like to note that audience members can use the Q&A box for any questions on Zoom, and they will be relayed to me. I'd first like to introduce Captain Peter Hammerstedt. Peter is the Director of Campaigns for Sea Shepherd and is Chairman of Sea Shepherd Australia. He is captain of the ocean-going vessel Bob Barker, and in 2014, the Bob Barker, with Peter as captain, set the world record for the longest pursuit of a poaching vessel at sea after chasing the Interpol-wanted fishing vessel Thunder for 110 days before its captain intentionally sank his own vessel in the Gulf of Guinea in a bid to destroy evidence. Since then, Peter has provided civilian offshore patrol vessels, colloquially known as shiprider agreements, to the African coastal states of Liberia, Gabon, Sao Tome and Principe, Benin, Namibia, the Gambia, and Tanzania in order to combat illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Ongoing partnerships between Sea Shepherd and the law enforcement agents of African coastal and island states have resulted in the arrest of 73 vessels for illegal fishing and other fisheries crimes over the past 5 years. Peter, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, David. It's interesting that you mentioned the Thunder because that's really where our private-public partnership model, why it came about. Ultimately, the Thunder was the most notorious fishing vessel in the world. It was infamous in fisheries circles. This was a vessel that was the subject of an Interpol purple notice. It was on several international blacklists, and it had made an illicit profit of over $60 million in its 10-year poaching career. My crew and I set out to locate this vessel, to bring them to justice, a 110-day chase covering 3 oceans and 11,000 nautical miles ensued. And ultimately, the vessel was scuttled by its captain in an ill-fated bid to destroy the evidence on board. I remember my crew and I and the crew of our sister ship rescuing the 40 crew of the Thunder and handing them over to the Sao Tome Coast Guard. And when the Sao Tome Coast Guard came out to take custody of the rescued crewmen, I noticed that the Sao Tome Coast Guard only had one small riverine patrol boat with a range of about 20 nautical miles, which was a quarter of the distance to where the Thunder ultimately sank. I remember when the ship was sinking, standing on the bridge of my vessel, wondering, out of all the places where the Thunder captain could have sunk his own ship, from the Antarctic to the Gulf of Guinea, why did he choose 80 nautical miles off the coast of Sao Tome? And when I met with the Sao Tome Coast Guard, I realized that the captain of the Thunder chose the Gulf of Guinea for the same reason why the Gulf of Guinea is a hotbed for illegal trafficking of drugs, trafficking of people, illegal fishing and transshipment, namely that there's inadequate monitoring, control, and surveillance. As I was chasing the Thunder up the coast of West Africa, I was in communication with a number of coastal states asking if they could intervene and arrest the ship. And ultimately, only one country returned my calls, and that was the Central African country of Gabon. I didn't know that much about fishing before the pursuit of the Thunder began, but what I came to discover is that 1 out of fish caught globally is caught through illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And I discovered that 90% of the global catch of fish is actually caught in the waters of a country, either within the territorial sea limit or within the exclusive economic zone. So that means that 90% of the world's fisheries there's actually a government with the authority and the jurisdiction to enforce existing regulations. So I realized that if we were serious about saving the oceans, about turning this tide of destruction, then we had to partner with developing island and coastal states. So after the sinking of the Thunder, I went to Gabon. I met with the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Environment, and the Minister of Fisheries, and we signed our first shipwrighter agreement. And I believe it's the first shipwrighter agreement in history between civil society and a coastal state. That partnership has been ongoing for 6 years. And what I've really learned is that there are so many groups and so many governments providing unbelievable tools, technologies like satellite monitoring. AIS technology has been revolutionary in getting an idea of what's really happening beyond the site of shore. Policy work that's critical. But at the end of the day, these technologies are force multipliers. And I've learned that they can't replace traditional policing methods. They complement them. They make traditional policing more effective. But at the end of the day, unless that intelligence is actionable, unless the coastal state has a vessel asset that can act on that information, can interdict, can arrest the vessel, then this imagery is basically just reaffirming that there's a problem out at sea. To give an example, I just returned from Gabon, where I spent 20 days at sea. I was joined by the Honorable Minister of Fisheries of Gabon. He spent a number of days out with us on patrol, and what he saw firsthand shocked him to the core. We boarded a shrimp trawler. This shrimp trawler was ultimately arrested for using the wrong mesh size. But while the minister was on board, he noticed that even though this vessel was registered as a shrimp trawler, only 0.2% of their catch was shrimp. The other 99.8% was bycatch, incidental take. The majority of that discarded overboard, dead. That shocked the minister to such a degree that he actually suspended the entire shrimp fishery of Gabon indefinitely. And that action would have only been possible thanks to the minister coming on board. If monitoring this vessel on VMS or AIS, it would be following all the rules. It required law enforcement to go on board, to measure the nets, to see what the actual catch was, to compare that to what the catch log records looked like, what the bycatch record looked like, to actually make the arrest. In Benin, when we arrived in Benin about four years ago, the maximum penalty for illegal fishing was a 10,000 euro fine. And so when we assisted the Beninese Coast Guard to arrest 3 trawlers that were fishing in a marine protected area, it was big news in Benin. And His Excellency Patrice Talon, the president, asked the Maritime Commissioner, okay, we've netted the bad guys. What's the penalty going to be? And when the Maritime Commissioner said, we're throwing the book at these guys, the maximum penalty allowed under the law, it's a 10,000 euro fine, the president was incensed. That ultimately led to legislative changes in Benin, to the point where last year, when we assisted the Beninese authorities to arrest another 2 trawlers, those vessels were each fined 250,000 euros. The captains were sentenced to 11 months imprisonment, and the companies were actually charged under Benin's Special Court for Terrorism and Economic Crimes. The maximum penalty under the law in Benin now for illegal fishing is 1.5 million euros. And again, would have only been possible if the Beninese authorities could see firsthand what was being taken at sea. And these arrests also generated media attention, which actually set the political agenda in Benin to take action on illegal fishing. Just another quick example, we've been working in Tanzania, where 19 Chinese longliners were licensed to fish for tuna. 2 vessels were boarded and inspected. Both vessels were engaged in illegal shark finning. Those vessels were arrested. And as soon as the other 17 vessels heard that boardings and inspections were taking place, they left the area. Because they did not comply with post-fishing inspections, each vessel was fined 350,000 euros by the United Republic of Tanzania, and none of them have returned. There's been no industrial fishing off the coast of Tanzania since those vessels were arrested, because ultimately the tuna operators there were also engaged in shark finning. And as soon as they knew that boardings and inspections were going on, they absconded from justice. I'm incredibly proud of the 8 country partnerships that we have, which have resulted in 73 arrests entirely under the direction of the government. What Sea Shepherd is providing is just this critical tool that's missing from the law enforcement toolbox: vessel assets, civilian offshore patrol vessels. And we've created a model together with our partner countries that we can see really works. And now we're hoping to export that model to other parts of the world, including Latin America and the South Pacific.
Thank you, Peter. Those are excellent examples. Hopefully we'll get more into those as the discussion goes on. Our next panelist is Sally Azell, Senior Fellow and Director of the Environmental Security Program at the Stimson Center. Sally leads a team of experts who explore the links between natural resources protection, environmental crime, and global security issues to develop security strategies that combat illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, thwart illicit wildlife networks, and increase transparency and traceability throughout the seafood supply chain. Prior to joining Stimson, Sally was a senior advisor on ocean issues to Secretary of State John Kerry, where she provided advice and technical expertise to advance U.S. policies in the international arena related to ocean, climate, and wildlife protection. Sally also co-chaired the operations of the IUU Seafood Fraud Task Force with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Sally, thank you for joining us.
Great. Good morning, and thank you, David, for that nice introduction. I'm sorry I couldn't be there with all of you in person, but I am grateful to be here virtually with the American Security Project and to have the opportunity to really talk about the important discussion on what we need to do in our public and private partnerships to counter IUU fishing. And also, I want to congratulate you, David, on the release of your new report. I read it yesterday. It's really well done. So at Stimson, the environmental program, as you just heard, we really engage civil society, governments, and the private sector. And through these partnerships, we develop solutions that cover a range of environmental issues, which David just laid out. Our program, what we try to do is we have a research to action model where we literally conduct research on an issue, often on the ground, and then draft the actionable policy recommendations. And then we seek partners who can really help us implement them. And as a result, our policy proposals are grounded in the real world and informed by practitioners' experience. And IUU fishing is a major area of focus for us. It contributes and generates annual profits of illicit profits of up to 23 billion a year, and makes up to about, 20 to 50% of global fishing catch. And IUU fishing affects most major markets. It's fair to say that most of us joining today's event have unknowingly consumed IUU fish. And as we heard earlier today, and just from Peter, IUU fishing practices are really detrimental to the sustainable management of fishery resources. They undercut the law-abiding fishing operations and are closely linked to transnational organized crime, trafficking, piracy, human rights, and labor abuses. And it also really reduces the food security of communities, threatens the livelihoods, and can often cause national and regional instability, particularly in many of the developing countries, whether it's Southeast Asia or West Africa, Gulf of Guinea, as Peter just highlighted. So the big question is why can't we stop this illicit activity? Well, obviously, IUU fishing is complex and it's a very opaque system with ships traveling all around the globe. I mean, there's such a lack of information about where these vessels operate, who owns them, the amount of fish they catch, how the fish is moved along the seafood supply chain, including transshipment at sea, or even when they get on land through the middlemen. So because of this, partnerships are essential. And that's what we do at Stimson. We work closely in partnership with a variety of stakeholders who combat IUU fishing. Just to give you a few examples, we released a report a few years ago called Casting a Wider Net, the Security Implications of IUU Fishing. The report really offered several specific recommendations to address the threat. So to highlight a few, we highlighted the need for improved transparency and traceability in the global seafood supply chain, expand capacity worldwide to improve monitoring and enforcement, increase data sharing and information. And again, as Peter just said, not just from surveillance, but all the way through to improving it through enforcement. And finally, we recommended that the US really needed a whole of government approach. So with this, we then, in a follow-on to our report, we worked closely with the House and the Senate to incorporate these recommendations into the Maritime SAFE Act which was passed and signed into law as part of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2020. And today, we continue to work closely with the many federal agencies who are now implementing the Maritime Safe Act: NOAA, State, USAID, the Office of Director of National Intelligence, the Coast Guard, DoD, Trade and Labor. And that's just naming a few, believe it or not. And then another example of how partnerships make a difference. We also author a report shining a light the need for transparency across distant water fishing. In this report, we identified global distant water fleets, where they operate, their motivations, and the impacts they have on specific nations. Not surprising, China was #1 with the largest fleet, followed by Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and Spain. And again, this research showcased the need for a global system for seafood traceability, essentially tracking seafood from where it is caught to when it enters global markets. The European Union and the United States have traceability programs, and Japan is beginning to develop their own system too. Imagine if China, the #1 largest fleet, signed on too. And then the report also pointed out the need for the government, the US government, NGOs, and tech firms to really continue to partner with coastal states to share data, information about IU fishing, and then train and enforce and really grow their capacity, whether it's with folks like Sea Shepherd or the Coast Guard. And these types of efforts can only be sustainable if those coastal nations themselves commit to combating IU fishing in their own waters. In some ways they can do this is by reinvesting some of their own revenues from the access agreements towards management, monitoring, and enforcement. Our research also spotlighted the need to make various types of information public. AIS, vessel monitoring system, should all be mandatory and turned on at all time, and that information made public, including on US vessels. And access agreements and the ownership of these vessels should also be made public, so we can really figure out what we need to do to get at the problem. And finally, just to highlight one more partnership, we've been working closely with the House Natural Resources Committee to support their bipartisan Illegal Fishing and Forced Labor Prevention Act. The bill incorporates many of our recommendations, but it also includes one recommendation about the need to expand the number of species covered under the US Seafood Import Monitoring Program, known as SIMP. So we're going to hear a lot today about how IU fishing robs coastal nations of their rightful resources, and whether we're talking about Southeast Asia, across the small island developing states in the Pacific, or in the Gulf of Guinea and their coastal communities. And from all of our work, transparency across the full seafood supply chain and in all fishing operations is really essential if we're going to end these illegal operations in the global industry. And ending IU fishing is very complex, and having government partnerships with the private sector, IGOs, and NGOs is so essential, because no one entity or no one country can do this alone.
Thanks. Well said, Sally. I think now we have an opportunity here to learn more about how that looks in practice, especially from the U.S. government side. I'm very excited about that. Our last panelist is Charles Rigo. Charles enlisted in the U.S. Air Force in August 1994. He's an F-15 fighter aircraft technician. Joined the reserves in 1999, and in 2005 was selected as an Air Force special agent. Charles deployed in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom, supported numerous missions throughout the U.S. Southern and Central Commands. In November 2009, Charles is assigned as a special agent in charge, Homestead Air Reserve Base. He is responsible for all Air Force counterintelligence, counterterrorism, and protective service operations in South Florida. In 2015, Charles was commissioned to the U.S. Navy Reserve. He is currently assigned as the Deputy Operations Department Head, U.S. Southern Command. Within his civilian capacity, Charles is a counter-threat finance analyst with Special Operations Command South. He focuses on maritime-related issues that impact both partner nation and U.S. interests within and around South America. Charles.
Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for the invitation to be a panelist today. like to start by saying 27 years ago, when I first entered the DoD enterprise, I would have never thought that IUF would be something that I would be looking at. I never thought it would be something from a defense enterprise. Ever thought that it would be a concern. But outside of the traditional security issues that IUF presents, not only for ourselves, but for our partner nations within maritime security, fishery stocks itself, it is something that endangers protected species, endangers coastal states, endangers environmental stability, not only for us, but our partner nations as well. It's a harbor for human rights violations and abuse, facilitates smuggling routes, everything from weapons to narcotics to human smuggling as well, and other illicit activities. Throughout the past couple of years, IUF has been primary focus of mine within SOC South Enterprise. What I've learned over the past couple of years, looking at this problem set, is from at least my perspective, defense perspective, we can't do this just strictly from the lens of a defense issue. The NGOs, the private organizations, universities that have been looking at this problem set for decades at a time, 40 years with Sea Shepherd, are the experts in this problem set. We learn from them. They're the ones that kind of provide us a broader lens into what this problem typically looks like. Typically, we'll look at an issue as sort of a fleet coming across. We've seen a lot of the issues with Ecuador in the past couple of years, how the fleets have grown. But the NGOs are really the ones that have highlighted what is actually occurring on these ships. Not only the depletion of fishery stocks, not only the additional catches affecting endangered species, protected species, other species that some of these organizations and vessels aren't licensed to catch, but also what occurs on these vessels, what occurs to the crew members, the instability that occurs not only in payment to some of these individuals, but how they're treated aboard some of these vessels. So it's something that we look at. It's something that through close collaboration with universities, with NGOs, various different organizations, we're able to highlight and utilize our abilities with our partner nations to try and develop means to, number one, mitigate if we can, highlight if we can, and provide the resources and ability for our partner nations to be able to combat it. We work closely with various different NGOs, with Interpol, and countless number of interagency partners from NOAA to DHS, and name it. I've contacted them to see how we can effectively pursue and mitigate some of these issues. It's a growing problem. I would say maybe a decade ago, the size of the fleets, especially for the area that I'm responsible for, Pacific and Atlantic sides, and the Caribbean as well, South America, it did occur, but not at the level that we see now, especially since about 2015, 2016, we see growing number of fleets. Many times we highlight what's occurring off the Galapagos because of the impact to the Galapagos itself, the environmental issues that it presents to the islands themselves. But these same fleets are operating all along that coastline. They come across, they operate within the Atlantic sides. And recently we've seen some of these same fleets operating outside of Gulf of Guinea and coming into areas of the Caribbean, and Northern Atlantic oceans as well. So it presents a significant security challenge for our partner nations. They have limited resources, and it expands their capabilities many times to be able to combat these issues. These fleets are very logistically savvy. We've already heard of their capabilities for transshipment. They're able to resupply at sea. They're able to operate for extended periods at sea, which expands the limited resources many of our partner nations have to be able to track them, to ensure that they're fishing within prescribed areas. So it's a growing problem. It's depleting resources, and it presents challenges that, if continued to be unchallenged or or unmitigated from a public-private partnership perspective will occur more in economic stability and with that security concerns for most of our partner nations. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. I think that illustrates very well. This is a global commons issue, really, and one that the United States cannot tackle on its own, nor really can any state tackle on its own. I'd really like to turn the discussion over to the audience. Please use the Q&A box for any questions you have for the panelists. But as we wait for those to come in, I want to kind of start with the overarching question, right? The United States, as well-resourced as it is, can't do everything on its own. It needs external partners from NGOs, private organizations. Where specifically can the United States benefit from that? And then as a follow-on, where specifically can the United States assist other nations by either facilitating links with NGOs or providing funding potentially to NGOs that can then assist other nations? And how does that happen in practice?
I'll take a crack at that. First of all, from a defense perspective, this is not a relatively new issue, but one that we're not very well versed at. So organizations such as Sea Shepherd have been doing this for 40 years. They're the experts. They're the ones that have been mitigating some of these efforts through their means for many, many years. They understand the fishery stocks. They understand where the movements are. They understand what the impact is towards not only economic stability for developing countries, but regionally how this moves for us. So we have much to learn from them, not just Sea Shepherd, but multiple different organizations that deal with this. Global Fishing Watch is another great organization. So at least from a Southern American perspective, the organization that we've been working with hand in hand through Florida National University and others to get a better understanding of how these fleets move, what the impact is, how big they are, and how they affect not only those fishery stocks, the economic security for these partner nations, so forth. So for us, the ability to understand what the NGOs see, put that in perspective with what the concerns are for our partner nations, for us within the SOCOM enterprise, for that regional stability and security, and putting that together to have a means to come out with mitigation solutions, either through our partner nations, bring them all into the same table, and utilizing us as a facilitator for that means provides at least a step forward solution towards trying to combat this at a global scale, instead of just identifying it as a defense issue for us.
Thank you, Charles. I can add to that. The shipwriter agreements between coastal states and civil society are relatively new, but shipwriter agreements are not. And the partnerships that we've established around the African continent are really modeled off of what the U.S. Navy and U.S. Coast Guard has been doing around the world for decades. There's now an increase in the threat of piracy in the Gulf of Guinea. While I was on patrol off the coast of Gabon, there was a piracy attack and a kidnapping that happened about 200 miles north of where my ship is. I know that the United States and European allies have renewed focus on combating piracy in the Gulf of Guinea. And I would urge that combating illegal fishing, IUU fishing, becomes a big part of that mission as well, that it's not just about piracy, but combating IUU fishing also. I think it's important to recognize the leadership that the U.S. government has shown on the issue of IUU fishing. The Department of State has been key to financing Interpol's Project Scale, which is under the Interpol Environmental Subdirectorate, which is in charge of investigating fish crime or supporting member states to investigate fish crime. They've been critical in getting the UN Office on Drug Crime to consider IUU fishing as transnational organized crime. That's under the leadership of the United States. And the United States has been really at the end of the spear in recognizing that the Chinese distant water fishing fleet is not only the largest distant water fishing fleet in the world, but also ranks first in prevalence of IUU fishing. When it comes to forced labor and those type of abuses, I know it's been of real interest to U.S. lawmakers and the U.S. government. So I think the U.S. government needs to continue in that direction. But I think including illegal fishing as more of the shipwriter agreements that exist would be huge. And I also think a recognition that a lot of our coastal state partners have intelligence that is of interest to anybody who wants to combat illegal fishing. Boardings and inspections, and Sally, you mentioned the issue of ownership. A lot of times, beneficial ownership can only be recognized through boardings and inspections. Well, it's our partner countries that are doing the boardings and inspections that may have critical information about insurance, about ownership, about who the real operators behind these enterprises are. And so I would urge continued dialogue there and continued support of our country partners.
Yeah, I'm going to take a slightly different tact and really focus on, we need to shut off the markets for illegal fishing. And that, again, goes back to the whole traceability issue that I was talking about. I mean, the US, the EU, and Japan are all starting to have their own seafood traceability programs. And that, when you combine those three markets, that's about 50% of all of the seafood that is sold around the world. And if we could get China and a couple other big countries, South Korea, others, to really take that leadership and have a global system that chokes off the IUU fish from entering markets, then you're not going to they won't have a place to sell. Also, the Port State Measures Agreement, that's an international agreement that really countries who sign on to that treaty have to look at all seafood coming in and deter and prevent any IUU from entering their shores. So there's a huge effort out at sea, as my two colleagues have just highlighted, but we also really need to choke it from entering the ports and the markets as well. And on the beneficial ownership piece, I couldn't agree with you more. It's just such an opaque system. We hear all the time, particularly in the Gulf of Guinea, although I saw it firsthand when I was in Mozambique a few years ago, where Chinese companies, for example, it may be illegal to have a foreign vessel fishing in your waters, like in Ghana, but often Chinese vessels will come across the world, and right outside the waters, they'll change the flag to a Ghanaian flag, or have both a Ghanaian flag and Chinese flag, and they call it joint ownership or a joint working agreement. And supposedly it's mostly that other coastal communities flag vessel, but in reality, it can often be people who know nothing about fisheries, who have just put their name on it as an entity, when in reality it's all Chinese owned, Chinese crewed, Chinese managed. And so that is the kind of information that needs to be made public if we're really going to get at some of these issues.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think kind of goes back to really resource limitation. We talk about, even the United States and intelligence about these kinds of things. There's only so much you can know as a government that has many different things on its plate. And so, the government relies on research by NGOs for flags of convenience to trace back ownership. And that kind of leads us into our next question from an audience member. From Layla, on estimated figures of IUU catch, what data is used to produce these estimations when population sampling of mobile species in and of itself is already so complicated? Have we potentially overestimated or underestimated these predictions?
Well, the figure that we often quote is from an Agnew study that was done over a decade ago, which is that globally the loss to the economies from IUU fishing is somewhere in the region of 10 to 23.5 billion. And it's such a wide range because nobody really knows. The estimate for off the coast of West Africa is that maybe 50% of the catch is IUU fishing. But again, nobody really knows. Trying to quantify how much of the catch is illegal fishing is like trying to quantify how big the narcotics trade is, or how these are industries that operate in the shadowlands, and therefore it makes it very, very difficult to know the extent of the problem. But what I've discovered through working with our country partners is that most of the vessels that we assist our country partners to board, there's usually some kind of deficiency. It doesn't necessarily have to be that they're fishing without a license, which is the clear-cut case of illegal fishing. Maybe they are licensed through one of these joint partnerships, but there's no fishing logbook to speak of. Or maybe even with some of these European operators, there's a fishing logbook, but there's no bycatch log. So a lot of these European tuna operators claim to only be catching tuna, or are only catching tuna, but claim that there's no sharks being killed in the process. You look at their bycatch logbook and no sharks have been killed in 2 months. You spend 2 hours on board one of these purse seiners and you see 20 sharks come up on deck, and 90% of them will die, even if they're released. So it does go back to the reality that we don't really know, which is why we do need greater transparency, why we need more satellite monitoring, and why we need to complement that with more at-sea patrols.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point about the monitoring. You know, this is calling it HR problems, probably not super accurate, but you know, it's people on ships, right? It's eyes on catches, and it's recording how much is being brought in. And the fact is, there's just a lot of ships out there that you know, you're not going to be able to cover everything, and so covering as much as possible is really the goal. Yeah, absolutely.
To add to that, this is a problem that's been occurring for years. It's highlighted now in the last couple of years, at least from a whole of government perspective. But these organizations, you look at some of these vessels at sea, they may look dilapidated, they may look barely seaworthy. But these are organizations that have been working in conjunction with each other for many, many years. They have their own logistical network. So it's difficult. You have multiple different ships that'll come to a refrigeration vessel, and you don't know what's intermingled with what. So it's difficult to identify quantitatively what that actually looks like. So we have to rely on what we see. We have to rely on what we get from our partners, both public and private. It goes to show some of at least the defense initiatives to try and highlight or combat this. So previous panelists mentioned the defense innovation competition that's out for AI research that's open to the public. It's a current competition to try and get more AI, more technical capabilities from the public. This isn't your typical type project where it may be resourced out through like a typical logistic network. This is something that we're opening to the public. Bring in your ideas. If you have something that technologically can be built to try and address IUUF, those are some of the issues that are out there. And I will forward at least the competition notice out from DoD, because we have to rely on the public. We have to rely on the NGOs to be able to combat this from a whole government approach.
David, if I can just add, since you mentioned flags of convenience, in the previous panel, there was a lot of mention of flag state responsibility. And the reality is that there are a lot of flags of convenience out there that fishing vessels do license to or flag themselves to, specifically because they know that that administration won't really pay attention to what they're doing once they're flagged. And so that's why we can't just be focused on flag state solutions. We have to also bolster the capacity of port states, because if it's an unscrupulous flag of convenience ship that's operating in the waters of one of our country partners, then it's really up to the Coast Guard, the Navy, the Fisheries Administration to do a boarding and inspection to see what's actually happening, because they can't depend on the reporting that's coming from the flag state.
Yeah, that's a really good point. In the last panel, it was mentioned what are boarding allowances? Do RFMOs allow third-party states to come in and board these vessels without that kind of monitoring ability? There's really going to be no accountability, no standing on deck for 2 hours, counting catch and watching what's going on. You have another question from Mark. kind of in light of the AP story that just came out, Josh's story that came out the other day, and the amount of squid fishing that goes on in Galapagos and Ecuador, the perspective from the audience may be that the U.S. Coast Guard and Navy have not been involved. South American coastal navies maybe haven't been involved. Now, I know that part of this is because of the size of the problem. I was wondering if you could talk us through kind of how those navies are involved in the way that they're limited from really being able to address it because of the size of it.
Can't speak for the Coast Guard or the Navy itself, but it is something that we have been involved, at least in trying to, number one, bolster our partner nation's capability and understand that problem set as well. So over the years, it's grown in number. Last year, I think, is the first time that we get more of a global attention on the size of these fleets, anywhere from 200 to over 300 ships at a time, and coming in and out of EEZs, coming in and out of not just for Ecuador, other partner nations as well. So the challenge has been, number one, is understanding it. And again, going back to public-private, this is why we rely so heavily on NGOs, on academic institutions, other government agencies to understand it. This isn't a typical problem set that we've looked at in the past. So it is something that we're growing and evolving towards. Previous panelists talked about Coast Guard Cutter Stone and its deployment last year, or earlier this year, I'm sorry, on its shakedown cruise, and its primary, one of its primary roles on its first cruise was for IUUF related issues. So yes, it is something that we're growing towards, and as we further solidify our partnerships with a lot of other organizations, it'll help us better understand it and eventually mitigate it.
If I could add to that, not just Coast Guard and Navy vessels or surveillance are the only way to approach those issues. I mean, when I think about, for example, what occurred last year in North Korean waters, where there was something like 800 Chinese vessels fishing illegally, it was Global Fishing Watch that first put a spotlight on those vessels. And then, there was a certain degree of diplomacy, environmental diplomacy, that took place afterwards with the Chinese government. And so sometimes it's the State Department, sometimes it is the UN, because that was a clear violation of the UN Security Council resolution around North Korea, which banned all trade with North Korea. And it became such a big issue, and there was so much pressure on the Chinese. What we have heard recently is there's been a reduction significantly of the number of squid fishing vessels in that geography. But, it's also another area to think about is how does China perceive IUU fishing? They don't consider fishing illegally in South China Sea, for example. They don't consider that illegal fishing in their local area. From them, IUU fishing is fishing that occurs outside of their geography. They claim that their neighboring countries are not, when they fish in other countries' waters, it's not illegal. That's another whole environmental kind of diplomacy issue that needs to be addressed with our and many other State Departments, foreign ministries, and the UN.
Yeah, I think the Chinese squid fleet is a great example of why that relationship between civil society and state actors is so critically important. And I have to start by recognizing that the U.S. Coast Guard is and was supporting Latin American allies, that there were U.S. Coast Guard assets in the Galapagos, in Ecuadorian exclusive economic zone, in partnership with Ecuador. And there's not a doubt in my mind that significantly deterred any incursions from happening by these squid vessels fishing illegally in the waters of Ecuador. That's the illegal fishing aspect of it. And that was largely taken care of by those patrols. But then we have to look at the unregulated fishing that's happening. Right? And then we're talking the high seas, which is 2/3 of the ocean, of the world's surface is the high seas. There, civil society is critically important. Global Fishing Watch has done unbelievable work in mapping out the activities and the actions of the Chinese squid fleet, identifying issues with so-called GPS spoofing, that these vessels were using multiple electronic identities. So some of these vessels were not using any electronic identity at all. And yet, to determine who the real identity of these vessels are, you then have to ground truth it on the ground. If a vessel is using 2 electronic identities, then only by actually physically sailing up on that vessel, photographing the name that's painted on the hull, can you know who the actual operator is. On the mission that was done with Sea Shepherd, with the Associated Press on board, 30 vessels were documented, including an oil tanker that's connected or affiliated with a company that's accused of violating UN sanctions on North Korea. Out of 30 vessels documented, 24 of these vessels had some kind of deficiency, whether it was that they were so-called dark, they didn't have their transceiver on, or that it was that they were using multiple identities, or 6 of these vessels had been arrested for illegal fishing before in the waters of Peru or Argentina, South Africa, Indonesia. 1 of these vessels had previously been the subject of an Interpol Purple Notice. 4 of these vessels had a past history of alleged labor abuses. And in fact, the Associated Press interviewed an Indonesian fisher on board a ship called the Shanghai 802. That Indonesian fisher said that he felt stuck on board, that he just wanted to go home. And when he discovered that the AP journalist was from the United States, he asked him, has COVID-19 made it to the United States yet? This was over a year after the WHO declared COVID-19 a pandemic. This is how long this man had been stuck at sea without access to communications. Has COVID-19 made it to the United States yet? That kind of information you can only access really by speaking to these people on the ground, interviewing them. And therefore, I think civil society has an important part to play in raising the awareness and the profile of these issues, but so does the media. And I do think that the People's Republic of China is becoming more and more sensitive to public opinion. And that is in large part because of the focus on the forced labor allegations.
It's, you know, the global problem with global solutions, right? Creating pressure from all sides on these actors to kind of clean up what they do and to stop these practices. We have another question, which I think kind of ties in very well with that, and is about EU regulations versus US regulations. So I'm going to read it verbatim here. It's from Manuel. European Union IUU regulation from 2010 has been reasonably successful in deterring and preventing IUU, although much needs to be done. Its basis is that only marine fisheries products validated as legal by the competent flag state or exporting state can be imported to or exported from the EU. Also, EU operators who fish illegally anywhere in the world under any flag face substantial penalties proportionate to the economic value of their catch, which deprive them of any profit. What would the panelists say are the main differences with the seafood import monitoring program and other US legislation between US legislation and EU legislation?
I'm happy to take a stab at that. The 2 programs, well, first of all, the 2 programs are very different, but before we get there is one of the things that we've just seen recently that shows how the EU system is so effective. I mean, the EU system has what's called a carding system, where literally catch has to be verified by the government that's exporting it to Europe, and it's called, and then the European Union, just like a soccer game, they card red, yellow, or green, and verify with those countries about a whole series of issues related to their seafood supply chain. And so, for example, I mean, just recently, you've seen Ghana really try to improve its seafood traceability, or Vietnam trying to improve their seafood traceability, because they've received yellow cards. And if they get a red card, they're cut off from the European market. So that is the way that the European system works. On the other hand, in the US, we have the Seafood Import Monitoring Program that puts the responsibility not on the government to verify, but it puts the responsibility on the importer of record. The importer that is bringing the seafood into the United States must verify that the catch they are bringing into the United States is not IUU. And so instead of NOAA having to, double check with the government where the seafood is coming in, it's the importer of record. And they do a whole series of audits with Customs and Border and whatnot. NOAA does, but they're very different. And the SIMP program is going through a whole amount of changes right now. They need more capacity. They need more auditing. They need to get back into the seafood supply chain, because what they're finding is the catch is paper-based. So there's so much, falsification of records. You don't really know as it goes through the middlemen. It's not ending up with, they're not communicating with the governments where the seafood originates. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the NOAA SIMP program. And they only cover 13 species, where the EU covers all wild-caught species. That's probably one of the biggest differences. And, we recommend going to all species, both aquaculture and wild-caught, because, if you're a fisher person and you're or an importer and you're trying to decide, is this species covered? Is this species covered? It's just so complicated. Just cover all, and you'll just, be able to really get a better sense, or at least expand significantly the list of at-risk species that NOAA covers. So one is leaving it up to the industry to figure it out and let us know if the species are IUU. The other is government to government. So I'll stop there. I could go on for quite a while on all of that, but I think one more thing, it's just so important we get away from paper and get to electronic catch verification all the way through the supply chain. Otherwise, we're never really going to know. And it's not fair in a way to some of those importers to have to understand what started at the beginning when it's paper that's going to the government. Sorry, it's an issue for me.
That's a great last point. And I think, expanding the requirements for SIMP and going to electronic tagging, these are, along with many things we've seen, these are areas where NGOs can make a difference. We talk about DIU with a very public program for monitoring, AIS and looking for algorithms that can detect illegal behavior. This is not something that you need some kind of super secret clearance to get involved with, right? This is a global problem that, has a global solution, both from private actors and from states. I'm going to ask one last question before we wrap this up from Anne. Are there global coalition efforts similar to the NATO coalition to address piracy off the East African coast to address IU or IUU?
I can't speak to East Africa. My area of expertise is South America. But I wouldn't say it's something similar to NATO, but there are efforts through partnerships with organizations such as Interpol to address a lot of these concerns. They're relationships that are building over time. Obviously, like anything else, when you're dealing with multiple different states, it's not a fast track process, but there are efforts in place. All these efforts have partnerships with public entities and partnerships with NGOs, such as Global Fishing Watch and many others. So yes, it is something that's coming online. Again, I can't answer for East Africa though.
One of the reasons that I mentioned early on regarding the Gulf of Guinea and the increase in anti-piracy patrols there and the importance of including IUU fishing as part of the directive or part of the mission is because we've seen what happened in East Africa. Somali piracy destroyed commercial shipping routes until the EU, the United States, Japan, and other allies started patrolling. But ultimately, the patrolling efforts were to keep the shipping routes open and safe. And though there's a lot of gratitude from merchant seafarers for that, but there's now approximately 400 vessels that are fishing illegally in the waters of Somalia, many of them from Yemen, from Iran, and these military vessels see these ships all the time. But fighting illegal fishing is not part of the mission of patrolling off the coast of East Africa. And there does need to be a greater push to see the interconnectedness of these issues. The fact that there are 400 vessels fishing illegally in the waters of Somalia as we speak is an issue of inadequate monitoring, control, and surveillance. The long-term solution to piracy in Somalia, which has been drastically pushed back, is increased monitoring, control, and surveillance. We have to see all of these issues as connected.
Now, and if I could just add on, in East Africa, there are regional organizations that have band together for monitoring, control, and surveillance from Kenya all the way south. I can't remember off the top of my head the name of what they call themselves, but they have band together in a regional approach to really combat IUU fishing. And I'll be happy to send you the name as soon as we get off and I can look it up.
Sally, it's Fish Eye Africa that you're thinking of?
Fish Eye Africa, yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And they do a tremendous job. They really do. And we've worked closely with them in the past.
Yeah, I think that's a great example to end on. An organization that a region has recognized they have a common issue. They've come together. They've got capacity not only from NGOs, but also from some U.S. government support, and really created a solution in one area and expanding that comprehension to the rest of the world. You know, this is not just a regional issue, region by region. I mean, we've seen these distant water fishing fleets, they don't just stay in the Gulf of Guinea, they move, right? Caribbean, South America. And so having something that is a global problem, bringing it to people's attention, and then utilizing, you know, on the US government side, a whole of government approach. We often think of things in terms of security, and so we immediately think Department of Defense, US Coast Guard, but there are really a lot of agencies that can be involved. And a lot of NGOs that can be involved in many different ways. And so I think I'll leave it with that. I'd like to direct everyone to our paper, Bad Catch, which goes into this in more detail. And thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it. We look forward to more work on this subject. And with that, I will leave you. Please get in touch if you have questions, and we'll be happy to work more on this area and with you all. Thanks very much.
Right. Thank you so much for including me.